Hello. Good morning. Last time when I spoke at the Symposium, Nick decided that the best time for me to speak was pretty much the last thing in the afternoon, for which I thanked him very much as the snow started to fall in Sheffield and people looked like they were drifting away, but they didn't at this stage. This time he's put me on the slot just before lunch, so thank you once again for a delightful space in which to speak. I'm a PhD student, part-time I hasten to add, so it's taken me a very long time. Part-time student looking at the impact of how digital media impacts on people's engagement. And engagement is a really important part of my whole PhD research. I'm really actually trying to struggle to work out what engagement actually means, and some of that might come through in this talk. So, as part of my study, what I've actually been doing is I've had the opportunity to look at 2 mobile phone apps that have been created as part of a research project within the city of Leicester. So these 2 mobile phone apps look specifically at Leicester's cultural quarter. Now the cultural quarter is used to be the St George's part of Leicester, and it's a very historical part. It's full of very old Victorian factories. It's very eminent for that type of thing, and it sits just about 5 minutes walk from the station, and it's quite a small, discreet part. In recent years, what we've seen is the council has poured a massive amount of money into the area and has created some very spanking, sparkling new buildings, such as Curve Theatre and other mainly cultural and arts facilities. So we also have the Phoenix Arts Centre. To be truthful, many of the people of Leicester find this quite peculiar because they regard the cultural quarter as a very run-down part of the city, and they actually find this juxtaposition of this very modern sort of big buildings right next door to the old factories a bit confusing. And what we have also seen is repositioning of certain buildings. So this is the old depot for the transport. It's the old transport depot, cunningly now called the Leicester Cultural Business Centre. So people can actually, it was the city bus depot, but now it's not. So what the area has now become is quite a swanky area for something. So this is an old factory, which is now apartments for city living. And you have quite a lot of things there, a really interesting juxtaposition of lots of things. There's also a whole set of venues, some of which still look quite run down. This is pretty much what they look like today, but I'm told during the 90s the Queen's Building on that side was a rave venue of some repute. Not that I know about it, but if you could read the rave crackdown plan there, you can read what they wrote about it at the time. So, as I say, we have this juxtaposition of a rather beautiful church that still sits there right next to, really rather fantastic 21st century architecture as well. The Effective Digital Histories project, which ran a couple of years ago, decided to look at these areas, and in particular looked at 2 areas. They looked at the cultural quarter in Leicester, they also looked at Gloucester. And what they looked at, they explored the stories of the people that used to live there. So they actually looked at archive material and they interviewed people. As part of this project, they actually had a sound booth that they put in place for people to come and share their stories of the whole area. So it was a very, very interesting project. 2 outputs from it, which I'll share with you. So one of them was an app called The Sounds of the Cultural Quarter. And the way this app works is it is a collection of some newly commissioned recordings that were taken of modern times within the cultural quarter, but also some historical past recordings that they used. And it's presented with a map and the overlay of these circles, and the idea is you can use it in one of 2 ways. You can either press on the circle and hear the sound, or you can turn on the GPS and you can walk around the cultural quarter, which is by far the more interesting experience, I have to say. And as you walk around the cultural quarter, as you pass through these circles, you will be presented with different sounds. And you might be in the past or you might be in the present. So if I get this right, when you read it better than me, the past is the purple circles, the orange is the present circles, and you can create rather strange effects by actually turning both on and walking around. So you're sometimes hearing 2 things happening in the same place, but from very different periods in time. So a very interesting little app. So lots of ideas that we can use there. At the same time, they produced another app called Hidden Stories. And the way that this was produced was commissioning of authors specifically to go and look at some of the archives. And they explored various archives, including the Leicester Mercury archive. And they had a look at different stories from this period. And 5 different pieces of creative writing were included in the app. And I'm hesitant to call them stories because they're very different. So there's a set of poetry in there, there's a very interesting, a short story in there, and there's some very interesting other ways. Choreographed poetry is in there, and dramatic readings are in there. So there's some quite interesting things. And the idea here is, again, you have a map, and you can choose to follow a particular route. Unlike the previous one that didn't have a route on it, with this particular app, you can choose the route that you want to follow around. You say, I want to follow this particular story, and you get taken around the area, and you stand in different places, and you read parts of the story in those places. And that's the way that these two apps actually work. So, in terms of, sorry, I just need to put this down. So my study overview, as I say, I very much wanted to look at engagement with the cultural quarter, but also with how people responded emotionally for an affective digital history project. That was quite an important thing, to see whether people were affected emotionally by it. So the final thing I looked at very briefly was actually the usability of these apps as well, and whether they did work properly. In truth, they don't entirely work properly, and so I didn't explore that in a great deal. There are certain technical issues with it, and I knew that before we started the project. I actually explained that to all the participants because I didn't want them to get hung up on certain aspects of it that didn't work. So we put that to one side and we just used the apps and went round. So what did I actually do? Well, I eventually managed to find a whole load of people that would come around the cultural quarter with me. It's not the sort of thing that you can just go up to the public and say, oh, I see you're in the cultural quarter. Would you like to use the app? Because they're not really aware of it, they're just walking through. So that is the one part of it that I found slightly upsetting in terms of the study. Everybody that came did this because they were doing the study and because they were doing it and they knew I was looking at stuff. So in a sense, you don't get a proper picture of what it's like for people who just might happen to land in the area and want to use these apps. So I did 16 visits between August and December. I have to say the weather varied considerably throughout that time. One person went around on their own, which was great, just seeing them go around. The largest group I took around was 23. I couldn't actually follow them all around. That was a bunch of MA students from Leicester University, and they all just went off in different directions, and I met up with them all at the end. But typically, even within that group of 23, they tended to come down to small groups, about 2 to 4 people walking around. The visits lasted 45 to 60 minutes on average. That was roughly how long they took, which surprised me because I thought people might give up. I didn't say to them, you must do this, you must use every single sound, you must read every chapter, but they decided that they would, which was great. And so even in some pouring rain, I still had students going around saying, yes, I want to look at I want to hear all the sounds, I want to do this, which was great. So 48 participants in total, 92% of them looked at the sounds of the cultural quarter, 52 of them looked at hidden sounds, and 44% of them actually did both apps. I was lucky to have a very nice age range, so I had some quite young people going around, some certain people in their late teens. I had some retired people going around, which was also interesting to see how they reacted. The majority of the people that went around were aged between 22 and 35. 30% of the people who went around were local to Leicester, and about 60% of them were from overseas. So the way that I conducted the study was to sit them down in the area and just do some initial benchmarking with them to find out what they actually felt about history, what they felt about the cultural quarter, what they knew about the cultural quarter. I did that initial benchmarking, but I also measured their emotions, how they felt about the cultural quarter, what their emotional response to it was, and I also measured their current engagement with the cultural quarter. I did give them a little overview of the app because I didn't want to waste time with them going, how does this work? So I did actually sit down there and say, okay, I'll just take you through and show you this is how it works, but that was really quite short. They then went on their visit. We then retired again to another cafe that I managed to find, and we would sit there and I would either do a discussion with them or an actual interview. And specifically, I would again revisit, so having benchmarked their emotional connections, we did that again. I went to see if there was any shift, and we did the same for engagement. And I asked general questions around what their thoughts were, what they found interesting, what did they find, had they learnt anything, and did they enjoy it? I also asked them for their positive and negative reactions to the apps. And again, I also asked them, so what could we do to make these apps more appealing and more engaging? So I didn't ask for technical improvements. They told me what technical improvements were needed, but I didn't actually ask for that. I was much more interested in how they thought we could deliver this to be a more engaging project. So I'm just going to show you now some of the results that I actually got from some of these things. So from the more statistical data that I gathered, we can find a few things here. I won't go through that in detail, so I'm going to go through each one. So I looked at the usability, and very, very quickly, because I used the standard sort of usability questions that you expect to see. And on the whole, I think you can see that people agreed with all the things that they said, yes, it was easy to use, yes, they were confident in using it, no, they didn't think it was complex, no, they didn't think it was very cumbersome. The only question where I felt that they were more critical of it was in functionality. And that's not very surprising. When we come to actually look at that, I think you'll see why they actually said that. So in terms of, I also asked about future usage, and I was quite surprised here actually, because there had been some rumblings about the apps as we'd gone round, and I was quite surprised to see how many of them then actually said, well, yes, actually, I would recommend this app to others, and actually, I would use it again. I was quite surprised by those numbers. And also, I think very interestingly, they would look for other heritage apps. I think that's a very positive outcome from this particular study. I'm not at all surprised that they don't want to use it frequently. It's just the very nature of these things. It's, once you've done it, you're not going to go and particularly do it again. So that makes pretty much sense. I asked about their future connections with Cultural Quarter. So I wanted to see whether it had inspired them to go back. And you can see the numbers are phenomenal that they do want to go back, and they would recommend it to others. I have to say that's mainly to do with the Curve Theatre, the bars and the pubs and the restaurants, not really the heritage. Well, some of it is the heritage, but not really the apps themselves. So I asked them about their increases in history, and in local history in general. Did they think that their knowledge and interest in the Cultural Quarter had gone up? And you can see that on the main, they said yes, a little bit. With the hidden stories, interestingly, we had a couple of people who said, no, not at all. There might be some reasons for this. Most of the people I took round already had quite strong interest in history, so to expect it to go up, again, was perhaps asking a bit too much. Having said that, I also think that those negative comments there are because they actually didn't have enough information in the apps to formulate more interest and to formulate more knowledge, so I do suspect that's what's going on there. So if we look at emotional response, what I did was I gave them 20 emotions. Can you read those? Yes. I gave them 20 emotions to have a look at. It's very interesting. Generally on the emotional scales, what we're seeing is people didn't really change their emotions a huge amount. So I've highlighted in blue and in bold where we've got the sort of major figures. What we did find was that where there was a positive shift, it was in admiration and pleasure, and amusement and interest as well. So I think that's quite interesting. I did a very similar thing with a set of criteria that I think relate to engagement. So again, they were presented with a whole load of ideas that I think relate to engagement. And we see a much bigger shift here, which is, again, something else I want to investigate a bit more. But in terms of engagement, I think we can see there is a bigger shift towards them being more positively feeling these particular elements of engagement. Even the bad ones, which is quite interesting. So I think it's quite curious that for a lot of people, they were more confused having used the apps. That's not entirely surprising, actually, because I think they found out what they didn't know, and they realised there was more that they didn't know than they thought they did. So some interesting stuff there. The ones at the bottom, not a lot of change. But what I do think is interesting is this, as opposed to the emotion, one of the things about the emotion is that even if they didn't change much, everybody seems to feel those emotions with a little bit more intensity, not less intensity. With this one, we get more powerful sort of responses on either side, which I think is quite interesting. So I asked them about their positive reactions to the apps and their negative reactions, etc. So this was more about the things that they actually said, so I don't have numbers to go on. The concept. They loved the concept. In the main, people really liked the idea. The sounds, they thought it was fascinating. The stories, they thought were very interesting. The difficulty was that there was a few people that didn't quite take to it, but in the main, I think people were very, very positive. They really liked the choice of sounds. So if you listen to the sounds, you have things from kettles boiling. We had kettle boiling earlier on. If you walk past the flats, you'll hear kettles boiling. If you walk past the Leicester Mercury offices, you'll hear the journalists inside having a chat. That's if you're listening to the modern times. If you're listening to the past times, you'll hear a typewriter. You'll hear the choir singing in the church. You'll hear the sounds of all the music venues, which I think are probably the most exciting ones. And I could always tell when people were listening to those. They found the stories very interesting, really constructed, really well written. They really did like that sort of thing. The visual design, I've got it on my phone if anybody wants to have a look at it later, but the visual design was really good as well. They did like the way it was presented. And I think they also found the fact that they could walk around accessing the inaccessible, so they could hear things inside the buildings without having to go in. Okay, what did they struggle with? They really struggled with technical issues. So if you're using it on an Apple, you get a much better experience than if you're using it on an Android. The GPS doesn't work so successfully, so I had some groups with people in both, and they would go, no, I've not caught up with you yet, and yours is already there, and mine isn't. So they really struggled with that, and there were certain other issues with the Android. And the one thing they really complained about was the fact it just ate their battery usage, which affected the fact that they then said, well, no, I wouldn't recommend it to other people because it's just eating my battery up. The biggest complaint of all was the lack of information. So I've listened to a sound, but I don't really know what it's about. I can see it's a music venue, but what music venue and where is that building and what's that all about? So there was a real struggle with actually understanding the context, the stories. They wanted more information about what was going on in the stories, which buildings was it referring to? And some of the stories didn't actually quite connect in with the area either, so that was a disappointment for them. They found the map design on the sound a bit confusing, and there were several concerns about personal security. There were several concerns about being disconnected from your surroundings. So if you're staring at your phone, especially if you've got headphones on, and if you look at this chap here, there's every likelihood he's about to step off into the traffic because he's not paying attention. So there are some safety issues around it, but there was also some issues about, well, all the time I was looking at my phone, I wasn't actually looking about what was going on around me. So I wasn't necessarily taking in the area. Some people felt the stories were a bit too long, some of the texts are a bit incomprehensible, so particularly some of our overseas visitors who don't have English as the first language really struggled. But even some of our native British speakers just went, do you know, that story's too complicated, I'm not going to do it. And as I said earlier on, they felt it much better when everything fitted in the cultural quarter and they could see the context and the relevance. So, did it engage them? Yes, it did. Certain things I could see them doing. They did talk about it, sparked curiosity. It made them walk down streets. Just that you would never walk down that street unless the app told you to do it and told you that there was a building down there that was interesting. But it encouraged them to walk down streets they couldn't normally go down. As this couple are sitting actually looking at one of the buildings, they investigated and explored, and I think they really enjoyed doing that. There were suggestions that it brought a life to a dead area. It enabled me, particularly the stories, I could visualise and imagine. And it gave me a reason. It gave me a reason to walk around this area that I just normally would walk through. There was some enjoyment. I've tried to capture some of it here. I could definitely tell when people were listening to the Caribbean Centre because they would start walking along the street and I just knew what they were up to. I said, you've got music now, haven't you? And they went, yes, it's really good. So they did test them with that. Some of them read the poetry out to each other. There was something about poetry that they just felt, I've got to read this to somebody else, and that worked really nicely. We also, these folks here are actually trying to act out the play. So they're actually following it round and standing outside some of the areas where the play took place. Some of them like the adventure of just exploring. You could certainly see conversations happening from people, and they talked about it a lot afterwards as well. And some of the people I took around who were local, who had lived in Leicester a long time, they started talking about their memories. Oh, I remember the Vestry Street Bar, so I remember this, and they would talk about all those sorts of things. In terms of interest, one of the interesting things I found about the things they thought were interesting was they found the buildings interesting. And yet this was two apps that actually spoke a lot about people. But when I asked what they found interesting, they said buildings and the architecture. Did they get to know more? Yes, a little bit, not a lot. They got an appreciation of the area. They could certainly describe it as vibrant and diverse, and they could describe the old and the new. Did they learn a lot? No. So, in terms of creating apps which engage, I think what I'm beginning to find, I'm still going through some of the data, definitely people wanted more information. Definitely wanted more content, and they wanted layered content. They wanted all sorts of things. They wanted it layered. They wanted to be able to go in further. They wanted to find out more information. They wanted an improved context. So they wanted it very clearly. I'm looking at this building. This is the person who lived in this building, and this is why we put this building on the app. This is why we put this sound on the app. They wanted more vocal content. So a lot of them said, could I have a story read to me, please? I would love it just to be read as I'm walking along. But also, if I'm listening to a sound, could somebody just talk about that? That was quite interesting, I thought. They wanted, curiously, more direction. They quite liked the idea that they could go where they liked. But some of them said, well, couldn't you present a set of sounds as these are all the music venues, or these are all the industrial areas, or this is something else, and actually give a little bit more of direction on it. More personalisation. I'd love to change the text, please. I don't like this coloured background. I'd like to put it in another language, please. So, not surprising that they're coming up with that. Improve the map. And the one that did surprise me, some people actually said, I'd like some instructions on how to use it. And I thought that's quite interesting, because I did that myself. I gave them the instructions, and I thought, but if they just landed there, I think they would have struggled a little bit. Things that I think need to happen, which did come up a little bit, there are lots of apps actually for this area, and if you looked all of them together, the content is already there. You'd pretty much answer everything that people have asked for. So I think there needs to be some sort of package created. I'm talking much more now about strategic thinking, about how this whole area is presented, and improving the promotion. So honestly, when you walk around Leicester, you're not really going to know these apps exist, and I think it's a bit like the Jain Temple again, actually. It's there as a fabulous resource. I'm not really sure it's there. So my conclusion is, did it engage people? Yes, I think it did. Did it alter their emotions? A little. The big thing that's come out to me that I find really interesting, because I'm trying to grapple with what this term engagement means, is that when I asked people about engagement, what they told me was they wanted to learn. Now, I never said to them, this is about learning. I said, have you had fun? Did you find it interesting? But predominantly they came back and said, what I'm trying to say is I think our users have an expectation that an engaging mobile device, mobile app, is going to teach you something. And if they haven't learned something, they don't feel necessarily engaged, no matter how much fun you've had. So I think that's just an interesting sort of side conclusion. That's me done.